What is up, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show, where I talk about anything related to SQL Server high availability and disaster recovery. Not necessarily the features, not necessarily implementation, but things that you have to consider to make sure that your SQL Server HADR implementations are not going to be complicated and you can support it. Speaking about supported, this is going to be today's topic of conversation. And I'm going to put it on the screen here. Supported HADR solutions, what it really means. One of the most common things that I have to deal with working with high availability and disaster recovery solutions is the common question: is this supported? And you know how it is, where you're dealing with multiple versions of supported Windows Server operating system. Going back now, it's Windows Server 2012, I believe, which is going to be end of support in no time, all the way to Windows Server 2022. So now we have a variety and several versions of the Windows Server operating system where you can run several supported versions of SQL Server. Like, for instance, hopefully you're no longer running SQL Server 2008, 2012, 14, 16, 17, 19, 2022. So the mix and match of combinations between Windows Server operating system and SQL Server operating version, rather, not operating system. And the thing about it is, even the choice of what version of SQL Server running on top of what version of Windows is sometimes a little bit confusing, because again, some features could be supported, some are not supported, depending on what version and what edition and the whole nine yards, right? So the more common question that I get asked is this supported, right? And there's documentation from Microsoft about what version of Windows and what version of SQL Server those combinations are supported. And we're not even talking about SQL Server on Linux, of course. SQL Server 2017 and higher are the only ones that are supported to run on Linux. It also depends on what flavor of Linux that you're running. I could run SQL Server on CentOS, Linux CentOS, but it's not officially supported. And I'm going to be on my own as far as both the operating system and SQL Server version is concerned. But again, there are a ton of documentation out there on what the right combination is: Windows version, SQL Server version, edition, feature set, and whatnot. And more often than not, people would ask for, is there a documentation that says this is supported? Right? They're looking for KB articles, official documentation, sometimes even a blog post, because sometimes it takes much longer to write an official documentation versus writing a blog post, where the blog post can simply state this is officially supported, even though there isn't any official documentation yet stating that this is supported, right? And we rely so much on vendor support mechanism to make decisions on what kinds of combinations of features, combinations of versions and editions of SQL Server versus Windows. And of course, not to mention, it is 2023. And if you're still deploying SQL Server 2016 running on Windows Server 2016, well, you're probably going to have to do it sooner, after the fact, because you're also looking at end of life and supported versions of um, um, both SQL Server and Windows. And that's why it's also important for you to start looking at the support life cycle for both the Windows Server version and the SQL Server version. But I'm not even talking about that here, right? Because there are official documentation that would dictate whether a combination of Windows, combination of SQL Server, feature set, edition, version, all of these things, you can. And if you're not sure, call Microsoft. They would give you some guidance on what version of SQL, what version of Windows, what feature set, what edition, and that it's fully supported. But that's not what I'm going to cover in this topic, right? Because I get this question a lot. Hey, if we are going to combine, let's say, for instance, distributed availability group with backup encryption, I'm just making stuff up, with column level encryption, and all of these things, right? Even that in and of itself can sometimes be confusing because the documentation does not explicitly say what is supported, and it's also not straightforward. And given the infinite number of combinations and we're just talking about Microsoft here, what about versions of SQL Server running on Windows Server operating system on top of VMware? And of course, VMware is not a Microsoft product, so you're now looking at, hey, who's supporting what, right? But again, this topic is not even about that, right? There are proper channels for you to start looking at what version of Windows, what version of SQL Server, if you're virtualizing stuff, what version of VMware supports what version of Windows and what version of SQL Server. If you're moving to the cloud, what version of the hypervisor, the Windows SQL Server on either AWS, Azure, or GCP or Rackspace, a lot of these combinations, right? But what I want to really focus on today are what I consider things that you, as a DBA, as a sysadmin, need to think about what it means to be quote unquote supported. And that's why I put in the word supported in quotes, because you really have to start thinking about this from your perspective, not from the vendor's perspective. The common misconception that a lot of people have, especially those that are supporting mission critical platforms and applications, is that I'm going to rely on whatever the vendor tells me is officially supported. Yes and no, right? Yes, because again, you don't want to be in a situation where you pick up the phone, you call Microsoft, and then they'll tell you, unfortunately, we cannot support your platform, your setup, your config, because it explicitly says in this KB article, in this documentation, that your setup isn't supported, right? Now, that's flat out explicitly telling you that this entire thing is not supported. And that's why you have to do your due diligence, do your own research. If you're unsure, call Microsoft, right? But I'm going beyond that, right? I'm going beyond that because the way I look at it, being supported does not just rely on the vendor. What do I mean by that? Again, let's say you're running SQL Server 2019 on a Windows Server 2022 VM running on VMware. And your VMware platform is also running on, let's say, an HPE hardware with a NetApp backend. All of these moving parts would have to somehow be officially supported in order for an issue to be routed and escalated properly to the proper channel. So if there is, let's say, database corruption issues with your AG, and then your databases are sitting on a NetApp storage, then you might have to call NetApp to make sure that there isn't something going on with a NetApp that's causing the corruption. Same thing, Microsoft might say, hey, I want to make sure that we're not dealing with something that's external to SQL Server. Why don't we bring in your NetApp engineers, or why don't we bring in your VMware engineers, and let's have a conversation, right? We are going even beyond that. That's the common misconception, right? What I want to focus on when I say supported is you. Yes, you, the sysadmin, if you're the one responsible for, you just got voluntold that you're going to be supporting SQL Server with HA on a VM with VMware on a, I don't know, whatever platform, right? It's you. When I look at the word supported, or when somebody says supported, I don't immediately look at the vendor, meaning I don't look at Microsoft, I don't look at VMware, I don't look at HPE, I don't look at NetApp in every single component that makes up your entire HA solution. Why is that? Because for one, when something happens, an outage happens, your cluster's offline, your AD cannot come back online, the vendor is not going to be your first line of support. Meaning, if you have monitoring tools in place, those pages, those alerts are not going to end up on Microsoft's queue. They're not going to end up on VMware's queue or HPE or Net. They're not going to end up on those queues or on those emails or email lists. They're going to end up on your mailbox. right? You create this distribution list where the DBAs, the sysadmins are in that distribution list, and then your monitoring tool is configured to send to this distribution list. By the way, that's you. That's not Microsoft. That's not HPE. That's not VMware. That is you. And that's why when I start talking about support, I mean you. So grab your pen and paper. Let's get ready. Take notes. I'm still old school. I like taking notes, right? Uh, Again, I go beyond vendor support here. I look at it from your point of view because when the phone rings, when you get that email alert, it is going to be you. So what does it really mean for your HADR systems, for your HADR solutions to be supported, quote unquote, supported? Number one, okay, in order for your HADR solutions to be supported, meaning you, right? You, the sysadmin, the DBA, whoever's responsible for taking care of it, it means that your HADR solution must meet your recovery point objective, your recovery time objective, both for HA and DR. Meaning this has to be very, very clear, well defined upfront, even before you start deploying your HADR solutions. I come in at an organization, they bring me in as a consultant. We start talking about different implementations, feature sets, combinations. And when I ask them, so what is your recovery point and recovery time objective for HA? Yeah, crickets. They don't know. And I can understand that because number one, it is not your responsibility as a tech professional to define what your recovery point and recovery time objectives are, both for HA and DR, right? It is not your responsibility. It is the business's responsibility to get a clear definition or have a clear definition of what the recovery point and recovery time objectives are. And most of the time I hear people say, or stakeholders, decision makers, we want zero downtime and zero data loss. You sure? Is that because you want it? Or is that because your customers demand it? Is that because you've heard that from somebody speaking at a conference and now you want it for yourself? Or is that what the business really needs? And this is expectation management. We are managing expectations from the point of view of both the business and the customers using the platform. I have had an opportunity to work with a security company. A couple of years back, they were building a multi-node cluster, or rather, they already have a multi-node cluster with multi-replica availability group, and they had multiple databases, and they want everything to they want everything automatically failed over. And I was doing an assessment of their environment. But before I did that, I started asking questions like, so what is your expected recovery point and recovery time objective for HA? We're not even looking at DR at this point. I don't know. We did not communicate that properly to the custom. And I asked a follow-up question. So what do your customers expect from you? Best effort. Well, we can't really quantify best effort because my best effort could be 4 days. Are they going to be happy with that? No. So, what is best effort? And we started fleshing out what it really means when they promise their customers best effort. It took a while. They started asking their customers. They started, and again, this is not a technical exercise. This is not the responsibility of the DBA, the sysadmin. This is not our responsibility. This is the responsibility of the business, the stakeholders, the decision makers, because this is what they're promising. If you're running a software as a service, this is what you're promising your customers, right? We will respond to incidents within X amount of minutes or X amount of hours, right? This is what you're promising. Like I said, defining recovery point and recovery time objective is really all about managing expectations. So it took us quite a while, about a week and a half. We got in there and they had a consensus. They asked their customers and they said, well, we kind of only need 4 hours. Wait a second, so you tell me you built this massively complex architecture with very expensive hardware and top of the line, gold level everything, and you're telling me 4 hours? Your databases could be restored in an hour and a half. So what's the point, right? And they started thinking about, like, true. Excuse me. They started thinking about that, and they were like shocked. Like, we went through all of this exercise building this. We started having issues. We had successive outages, all for nothing. Well, it's really not for nothing. If at all, you were able to clearly define what your recovery point objectives and recovery time objectives are for HA. For DR, it was days. They kind of have an understanding about DR. But this is the key. It has to start with defining your recovery point objectives and service level agreements, both for HA and DR. Because this is the foundation of how you would respond to incidents, you would react to incidents, how you would pour resources into it, whether or not your solution actually meets your recovery point and recovery objectives. This is the starting point, right? Start with this. It's defining clear expectations. And I keep emphasizing this is not our job. It's not our job to set the expectations. It is our job to guide business stakeholders and decision makers and even the customers to guide them. Hey, what's the impact if we're down for like 4 hours? I usually start with 4 hours. What's the impact if we are down for 4 hours? Well, not really. Oh, what about if they say not really? I push, up. What about 6 hours, 7 hours, 8 hours? Well, an AT is not worth it. You're complicating things. A cluster is not worth it because you're putting in a lot of these moving parts, and you can restore your databases in an hour and a half or 3 hours even. So you don't need this, right? Again, recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives for both HA and DR is the starting point. Don't come up with an HADR solution without these. And I know it's challenging, really challenging, if the business, the stakeholders, the decision makers, they don't even know what it is, right? But our responsibility is to get the conversation started so we have clear set of expectations, both externally, meaning for the business, for the customers, and within the team, right? That's the first one. The second one is you have to have a clear and well-defined escalation procedures. I'll say that again. You have to have a clear and well-defined escalation procedures. When a customer or a client brings me in and they want me to do an assessment of their availability group, I ask questions that have nothing to do with the AG, like this. What's your escalation process? Or I'll backtrack. What's your recovery point? What's your recovery time objective for HA and DR? I'm more concerned about HA rather than DR, because DR's expectations are a little bit loose compared to tighter expectations when it comes to HA. So getting that clear, getting that out of the way, my second question would be, what's your escalation process? Huh? And it's interesting because the way you meet your recovery point and your recovery time objectives revolve around your escalation process. I couldn't count the number of times when I get brought in, the entire system is down. They have been trying to fix the issue for quite a while, and they couldn't bring the databases online. The first question I ask before I even do the work is, what's your recovery point and what's your recovery time objectives for this? If it's already beyond that, even though I can fix a problem in 2 minutes, I don't. Why? Because it's never about I'll I have to emphasize this. It's never about technical resolvability. At that point, it's now a legal conversation. Why? You have blown past your expectations. you have gone past your recovery point and recovery time objective. So I'll give you an example. Let's say, for instance, you have a 4-hour recovery point and recovery time objectives for both for HA. And then your engineers start fixing the problem, they troubleshooting the issue, and 3.5 hours later, they still couldn't fix it. They come to me at the 4-hour mark. During the conversation, I'll ask a question, and then they'll say, okay, 4 hours. I can't do it. It's not because I can't really do it, but because this is no longer a technical conversation, it's a legal conversation. I've been in meetings where the customer is suing the service provider because they did not meet the expectations. Again, the recovery point and recovery time objectives. To a point where one of my customers wanted me to do a root cause analysis because now they wanted to sue the service provider because they did not provide a proper turnaround. They were a financial company, and the service provider promised X amount of RPO and RTO. So 2 hours, for instance, they've gone past 2 hours. They managed to bring everything back in 6 hours, and now the customer is furious. And that's why you need to have a clear and well-defined escalation process, right? In order for your HADR solutions to be supported, and keep in mind, this is you supporting it, you have to have a proper and well-defined escalation process. Meaning, if you have a 4-hour recovery time objective, right? How long can you sustain, or how long can you afford for this entire system to be offline? If you have a 4-hour RTO and you're already pushing beyond the 3rd hour, pick up the phone, call whoever needs to do the work. I couldn't count the number of times when engineers and DBAs and sysadmins, they would start fixing and fixing and fixing, and they're not looking at their time. They're not looking at their watch. They're not, all because they just want to solve the problem. And that's fine. That's okay. You're getting paid to do your work. You're getting paid to solve problems. But if it's a mission critical system where you have a clear cut recovery point and recovery time objectives, and you're blowing past that, you're doing yourself and the business a disservice if you still work on the issue despite it being over and above the clear, well-defined recovery point and recovery time objectives. This is key. Like I said, even though I know I can bring the AG, the databases online as quickly as 5 minutes, I don't, because I don't have lawyers that can defend me if in case somebody said, hey, we're suing you because, right? And that's why it is important to have a clear and well-defined escalation process. 4 hours, try to fix it. 2 hours have passed, time to escalate. Whether it's within the organization or senior escalation engineer, or escalate it to your vendor. If that's Microsoft, call Microsoft support, because time is ticking. Watch the clock. Take stock of how long it takes for you to fix it. And that's one of the reasons why it's very, very important for you to do DR exercises or drills, simulating issues and outages where the entire team knows exactly what to do when X happens or when the situation happens, so that you know, hey, I can do this in 4 minutes. Yeah, I'm starting to sound like I can name that tune in 5 notes. No, because again, if you have practiced, if you have rehearsed, you kind of have an idea of how long it takes for you to get this thing resolved. And if not, again, watch the clock, pick up the phone and call your vendor, or escalate it, and keep looking at the clock. Make sure that you're not blowing past your recovery time objective, because again, beyond that, it's no longer a technical conversation, it becomes a legal conversation, right? Third thing. So the first one is it meets your RPO and RTO requirements, both for HA and DR, which means you definitely have to have a clear and well-defined RPO and RTO for HA and DR, right? Second one is you have to have a clear and well-defined escalation procedures where that what happens when an email alert comes in, outage situation, who gets notified? How long will it take for them to fix the problem? And are they cutting too close to their recovery time objective? And what will they do next? Do they escalate, or do they continue to fix the problem? Uh, is there a well-defined escalation process? And number three, you have to have competent staff with the right skills to handle issues and potential outages. Right skills. And this is very important because, again, we're dealing with mission critical systems. If you're cutting so tight and you have a very, very tight recovery time objective, and of course, recovery point objective, if you have very, very tight, you can't expect the most junior guy to be on the phone or to be dealing with this if they're not properly trained. I couldn't count the number of times when an external consultant would come in, they would build the system, configure it, hey, everybody's happy, and then they leave, but not prepare the internal staff for this, because the consultant is not going to be the first line of support. They're not going to get called in the middle of the night. It's going to be the operational staff. Are they properly trained on the escalation procedures? Or are they just going to forward the ticket to whoever, not even looking at it, and probably end up sending the ticket to a different team that has nothing to do with your AGs and your failover clusters and your HA solutions? Again, in addition to having a clear and well-defined escalation process, the people who will be handling the outages and the incidents and the tickets need to be properly trained. You may have heard of my story when I broke my leg a couple of years ago. I certainly don't want to be in the OR with a doctor that just got out of med school. I want somebody who has done this over and over and over again and can do the surgery, so that I can feel confident that I can be able. And good thing that the doctor who did the surgery was that he's done this surgery a couple of times now, so he's very well versed and he knows what he's doing. But the thing is, we are handing our HA, mission critical solutions, to people who don't even know anything about failover clustering, about HA, about SQL Server, about availability groups, nothing. All they know is when an alert comes, they will forward the ticket to whoever. They don't even bother reading the ticket, right? We have to properly train the people who are part of the operational process. Train them on how to manage the availability group, the failover cluster, the HA solution. Train them on the proper escalation process. Like, what do we need to do? System down. We had an outage. This is what we need to do. Step 1, 2, and how long do we need to spend on each step? Because again, going back to number 2, you need that clear-cut line. If they haven't fixed the problem yet after X, escalate. Right? And of course, make sure that you're escalating to the right people. And one thing that I emphasize is, it's not enough for you to have competent people. It's not enough for you to have all senior engineers. They also have to be available. I mean, what good are very senior, highly skilled, well-versed in the technology engineers if they're not available? They're on a different time zone, they're on vacation, they're on sick days. Right? What's the point, right? It also doesn't make sense for you to have available people who don't know what they're doing, right? They have to both be available and capable. When you're putting staff to do the operations like monitoring, taking care of your HA and DR solutions, they need to know, number one, they have to be capable. They have the skills, they have the capabilities, they've done this, they know what to do, they can follow procedures. And number two, they also need to be available. Available only is not enough. Capable only is not enough. They have to be available and capable, right? When I come into a customer environment and start laying down the processes in order to properly support it, I keep telling them, look, if this for you is a mission critical system where you need 24/7 support, you need to make sure that you definitely have 24/7 support with people who are capable of doing this. right? You cannot expect somebody who's like, okay, we'll give you on call, and the guy happens to be on call throughout the week, and he's been tired and exhausted. He cannot even hand off the on call assignment to anybody because he's the only person on call, right? Make sure that you have available and capable people who can respond to incidents, to outages, and knows they're well trained, they're well versed, they're highly skilled, and knows what the escalation processes are, escalation procedures, and what the expectations as far as RPO, RTO are concerned, both for HA and DR, right? So those are the three things, right? What it really means for your HADR solutions to be officially supported. Because again, at the end of the day, it's not going to be your vendor. Your first line of support is you, or maybe you have your operations engineers taking care of the tickets and the alerts, and they escalate them to you. But Microsoft is not your first line of support. AWS is not your first. You are the first line of support. And that's what it really means when somebody starts talking about, is this supported? Well, can you support it? Is the first question, right? We have gone past the conversation around, is this officially supported? Because you definitely need to read the documentation, do your own research, or if you're second guessing, call Microsoft or the vendor, whoever's responsible for the entire platform. Call them and then ask, is this officially supported with a combination of features, versions, editions? But this is beyond that now, because you are going to be the first line of support when something happens, and you need to have a clear cut, well defined recovery point, recovery time objectives for both HA and DR. Number two, a clear and well defined escalation process where you know how people need to respond when an issue occurs. And number three, available and capable people who are skilled, who are well versed, and who are trained on how to deal with issues and potential outages, right? So that's about it for this week's topic for the Practical SQL Server HADR show. And if you need any help, like for instance, you're running your availability groups and you've started to notice that your databases are growing, the failover time is taking so long, and you need some help with assessing or reviewing the environment, or maybe you're planning on creating or deploying a new HA solution, you need some guidance on what the, not just the proper combination, but rather properly designing the system in order for it to meet your recovery point, recovery time objectives, as well as having a clear and well-defined escalation process and potentially training your team as well. Reach out. Use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session where we can have conversations around these topics. Like, do you have a clear-cut recovery point, or well-defined recovery point and recovery time objectives for both your HA or DR, whether you have an existing escalation process and everybody on the team is aware of it. Number three, whether or not you have available and capable people who can support this, who know how to deal with outages and potential issues. Again, reach out, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. Let's have that conversation, right? Tune in again for the next episode of the Practical SQL Server HADR show. Enjoy the rest of your week. I'll see you again next time. Goodbye.